and welcome to this tutorial. Today we're going to explore the rendering options of VRay Next for SketchUp 2020. When you start creating a scene inside of SketchUp, you can start VRay rendering at any point. It's not only used for production, but you can also use it for look and development and the overall creating of the feeling of your scene. The VRay rendering is situated and can be accessed a few ways inside SketchUp. As the first one you see, the main one you see is on top at the toolbar here, where you will find shortcuts for the main VRay rendering options. And another way to access the different types of renderings inside VRay is going to the asset editor, and there in settings you have the options very clearly marked, or also from the shortcut and the drop down you can access production rendering, cloud rendering, and by default the interactive render here. Let's explore what are the differences between those, and I'll start with the interactive render. VRay's interactive render by default would work on your CPU, meaning that it will use your processor for interactively rendering the scene. If you want to switch to GPU rendering with the interactive option, what you need to do is before you start the rendering from here, pick not CPU but CUDA if you're using an NVIDIA GeForce or GTX series card, and RTX if you are using an NVIDIA RTX new generation card. Besides this, the main suggestion is that if you're planning on rendering the whole scene on CPU, work on CPU, and if you're planning on rendering even the end result on GPU, from the beginning, work on GPU. Besides this, the main advantage of the interactive render is that not only it supports almost everything that the production rendering of VRay supports, but it gives you the possibility to see changes you make in the scene instantly, being rendered and getting better over time. So if you like what you see, you can always leave it and the image will get better over time. The interactive render is a great way of developing materials, illumination, camera composition, and everything in the scene that needs a little VRay magic. You can see that even if I go into SketchUp shadows and change the position of the sunlight, it's instantly recognized by the interactive render, allowing me to get a beautiful example of this. Another great thing about the interactive render is that it's not only available for the VRay frame buffer, which you see me using right now, but you can also start the interactive render inside SketchUp's native viewport. So from the shortcut where we started the interactive, we can go to this shortcut, Viewport Render, and if I click on this one, automatically it will render in. Especially if you want to check a specific detail inside of your scene, like a material or how a geometry piece looks inside rendering. And of course, if you want to stop the interactive render, even in the viewport, you just need to disable it from the toolbar. Then, as we mentioned, VRay is one of the few renders that can render GPU and CPU, whichever one you pick. And in this case, I want to show you how even in CPU rendering, you can actually take advantage of your graphics card by using the denoiser. VRay supports two types of denoisers, the NVIDIA I denoiser and the VRay denoiser itself. The idea for both is the same. We render to a specific quality, then the denoiser, based on your GPU, does its magic, giving you a better picture for less time. Yes, some denoisers may result in a loss of detail, but like interactive rendering, over time they get better, and especially for the NVIDIA I denoiser, which I want to show you. This one is great for look and development and for getting a better, clear image of the scene, especially in the beginning, especially when creating the illumination and the whole feeling of the picture. So besides turning it on from the switch here, I need to update effects to make the slider at rapid, so I know that every pass, let's say, the denoiser will be updating after the interactive render. Then if I start interactive, in the frame buffer in this case, because I want to show you the difference between the denoised and the not denoised image, you can see how quickly the image became clearer, even though there is some loss of detail here. It's giving me a much better feeling of the image. And since it's based on the interactive render, over time the denoiser, the NVIDIA I denoiser, will also become better. Denoisers are amazing not only for look and development, but also for final rendering. But the main suggestion here is that you use the NVIDIA I in the process of making in the scene and switch to the VRay denoiser when production rendering. Another thing that may be quite useful while rendering in interactive is if you want to focus on, let's say, a particular camera view and just change the illumination, you can lock the camera without creating a separate scene stage from the shortcut in the VRay toolbar. And now if I move, it's not changing the interactive render. But if I, for example, change the time of the day, it is affecting the interactive render, allowing me to easily select, change geometry, change time of day, so on and so forth, without moving my camera and distracting my focus. Using the interactive render while creating your scene and your renders, it's an actually huge advantage because it allows you to be prepared to render production at any point since you've been seeing the lights, the materials from the beginning of the scene. In this case, I have already created the camera view I like and I want to use, and I have also created the illumination for that. You'll notice that the view here is not changing because, as we remember, I have locked it. Let's unlock it and go into the camera. Now I have my camera view and time of the day, which I want to use for production rendering. Since I was hiding the tags or previously known layers with the interior furniture, exterior furniture trees, you can see that by going in camera view, they automatically appeared as SketchUp normally would. The denoiser is still working beautifully, and you can see this denoised image, while the beauty pass, the RGB color, is still quite noisy. And this is one of the main power of denoisers. It actually allows us to get a better feeling of the whole image. Now that I like what I see here and I'm ready for production rendering, let's explore a few ways of rendering final high-resolution images in VRay. You can access those from the toolbar by pressing just the render shortcut, but I want to go a bit in depth about the types of production rendering VRay for SketchUp supports and how you can change their settings. I want to talk more about cloud rendering, but since this is quite a long topic, I think that we'll leave it for another video. Just so you know, you can access the VRay cloud from the shortcut here inside the asset editor or from the toolbar itself. Then, when it comes to production on your own machine, not in the cloud, the main thing to do is switch off interactive since we want to go into progressive. VRay supports two main types of production rendering, which are progressive and bucket. The difference between progressive and bucket is that with the buckets we have, of course, the buckets rendering our image and we need to wait for them to finish. While with progressive, like the interactive, we have progressive path tracing where we start with a lower quality image and in time it gets better. Both have their own advantages, especially one of the advantages of progressive rendering being that even if I start from here, let's enable it, I can limit my rendering to time. So if, for example, I have only 2 minutes for rendering, after 2 minutes of rendering, I can stop this and say, okay, this is the best we have for 2 minutes. While with bucket rendering, we need to wait for each individual bucket to finish rendering to have our ready image. You can see that the progressive sampler looks very much like the interactive rendering, but since it's production rendering, if I change the time of the day or move my viewport, nothing will change because it's rendering. The denoiser is still working and this is still the NVIDIA IE denoiser, while for the final production rendering we'll switch to the VRay denoiser as well. Great thing about progressive rendering is that as I mentioned, I don't need to wait for the whole image to finish rendering. If I like what I see here, I can just go and stop the render and use this image afterwards. The control of the progressive render is not only done by you stopping the progressive path tracer, but you can also control it from this quality slider, which is super easy to work with. As you can see, it just has presets for the rendering. In most scenes, in most cases, this will be more than enough and you won't need additional settings. But just so you know, all of those presets are linked to the render parameters on the right and you can see what kind of settings they are offering if you are familiar with VRay settings. This is not necessary. Again, in most cases, the presets here would work wonders. Have in mind that those presets also control the global illumination settings, as you may have noticed. And with interactive rendering, which is the main difference here, we don't have this control over the global illumination in such depth. We see the results from our progressive render, although I stopped it very early. I want to show you the denoised one as well. Let's do a bit higher resolution render to see the bucket rendering as a final treat for our tutorial. In order to go into bucket rendering, I just need to disable progressive. Let's set the quality to medium, enable the VRay denoiser switching from the NVIDIA IE denoiser, change the update effects to the at the end because we need a final render and we need the denoising when we finish with everything, and I can change my render output or the resolution to something bigger. Let's go full HD for the width, and the height is by default. So now what I need to do is press render, wait for VRay to load everything just to be sure that my scene has started rendering. Then I can go grab a cup of coffee or tea and come back in a short while to see the rendering. Let's magically speed up the video a bit. As you see, the last small buckets have finished rendering, and now we have our full image rendered with buckets at medium setting. You can notice that the bar down is being filled up. This is the denoiser doing its job. And now VRay automatically has switched to the VRay denoiser in order to show us the ready to be used denoise image. And a great thing to see the difference here is just switch between the RGB, the beauty path, and the denoise, which this is the RGB. And you notice that there is some quite visible noise, especially in the reflective windows, in the water, in the tiles here, and so on. And if we switch to the effect result, which is the denoised path, you notice that the water is much smoother, the tiles are much better, the windows are much clearer. And as I mentioned, denoising is quite dependent on the rendering itself. So the better the rendering, the better the denoising would be. All in all, VRay allows you to render in many different ways, from interactive on CPU, GPU, and even RTX GPU, through production on the CPU and on the GPU with progressive rendering and bucket rendering. And if you like to improve your rendering time even more, you can always take advantage of the 2 denoisers that VRay has to offer. Enjoy your rendering!